The submarine slowed first, then it went silent. In the black water off a Japanese-held island, engines stopped and the hull drifted, barely disturbing the surface. Inside, men waited without speaking. Every sound mattered now: a dropped tool, a shifting boot, a breath taken too fast. Japanese patrol boats were somewhere beyond the darkness, their listening devices tuned for exactly this moment. Above the control room, the hatch opened. Cold air spilled inside. A rubber boat was hauled into position, its black surface absorbing what little moonlight remained. One by one, figures climbed toward it, carrying radios sealed in wax, pistols wrapped against salt water, maps drawn by hand and memorized in case they had to be burned. There were no insignia on their uniforms, no identifying papers. If they were captured, they would not officially exist. This was how American intelligence reached places aircraft could not and ships dared not approach. By 1942, Japan controlled vast stretches of the Pacific. Islands bristled with coastal guns, observation posts, and patrols. Beaches were watched. Harbors were mined. The air above was dangerous. But the sea, deep, silent, unpredictable, offered another path. U.S. Submarines, built to hunt enemy shipping, became something else entirely. They became delivery systems for a hidden war. From their decks, spy teams slipped ashore in darkness. They landed on reefs, mangroves, and empty stretches of coast the Japanese believed unreachable. They vanished into jungle or mountain terrain, sometimes within sight of enemy positions. Their task was simple to state and almost impossible to execute. Observe without being seen, report without being found, survive long enough to be retrieved. These teams mapped airfields concealed under trees. They counted aircraft by listening to engines at dawn. They watched troop movements, supply landings, coastal defenses. Some worked alone. Others linked up with guerrilla networks that had been fighting in isolation since the war began. All of them relied on one thing: the submarine that might return weeks later or might never come back at all. For submarine crews, these missions were unlike anything they had trained for. Instead of torpedoes and targets, they carried people. The success of entire invasions would depend on whether these men made it ashore unseen, and whether their reports made it back through hundreds of miles of enemy-controlled waters. The landings that would later define the Pacific War, New Guinea, the Philippines, the push toward Japan itself, did not begin with bombardment. They began here, in silence, in darkness, beneath the surface of the sea. And to understand how those invasions succeeded, the story must begin with why submarines became the only way in. The need to land intelligence teams by submarine emerged from failure. In the opening months of the Pacific War, American planners discovered how little they truly knew about Japanese-held territory. Pearl Harbor had shattered assumptions about warning and preparedness. The rapid collapse of Allied positions across Southeast Asia and the Philippines revealed another weakness, just as dangerous: an absence of reliable, on-the-ground intelligence. Before the war, much of America's intelligence about the Pacific relied on diplomatic reporting, commercial shipping observations, and limited aerial surveys. Once Japan began its expansion in late 1941 and early 1942, those channels disappeared almost overnight. Consulates closed, merchant traffic vanished, radio silence spread across occupied islands. In places like the Philippines, New Guinea, and the Solomons, Allied personnel were killed, captured, or cut off. What remained were fragments, isolated coast watchers, scattered guerrilla groups, and incomplete maps drawn before modern fortifications existed. At the same time, Japanese forces moved quickly to secure coastlines. Observation posts were established along beaches and headlands. Patrol boats swept nearshore waters. Aircraft monitored likely approach routes. The enemy understood that control of the littoral zones meant control of access. For Allied intelligence, this created a problem without precedent. Traditional insertion methods, small surface craft, aircraft drops, or covert landings disguised as civilian traffic were now either impossible or suicidal. Aerial reconnaissance offered some answers, but not enough. Aircraft could photograph runways, harbors, and roads, yet dense jungle, camouflage, and deception limited what could be seen from above. Japanese engineers hid airfields beneath trees, dispersed aircraft into revetments, and constructed decoys that misled even experienced photo interpreters. Bomb damage assessments were often wrong. Targets believed destroyed were repaired within days. Intelligence gaps persisted, especially in areas scheduled for future invasions. The question became unavoidable. How could the United States insert observers behind Japanese lines without alerting the enemy? The answer came from an unexpected direction: the submarine force. At the start of the war, U.S. submarines were designed almost exclusively for commerce raiding. Their mission was to strangle Japanese logistics by sinking merchant shipping. Intelligence operations were not part of their doctrine. But submarines possessed unique advantages no other platform could match. They could approach enemy-held coastlines undetected. They could remain submerged for extended periods. They could appear where the Japanese did not expect them, then vanish again without a trace. Early experiments were tentative. In 1942, submarines began rescuing downed airmen and evacuating isolated personnel from enemy territory. These missions demonstrated that submarines could operate close to shore with precision. Soon after, intelligence officers proposed something more ambitious: not extraction, but insertion. The risks were extreme. Submarines operating near shore faced shallow waters, reefs, mines, and increased risk of detection. Surf conditions could capsize small boats. A failed landing could expose both the submarine and the intelligence team. Extraction, weeks or months later, was never guaranteed. Yet the alternative, fighting blind, was worse. The first submarine landings of intelligence personnel were limited in scope. Small teams were inserted to re-establish contact with coast watchers or assess conditions on specific islands. These missions provided immediate value. Scouts confirmed which Japanese units were present. They reported on airfield construction, troop strength, and defensive layouts. Most importantly, they proved the concept worked. By late 1942 and early 1943, the process became more deliberate. Coordination increased between the U.S. Navy, the Office of Strategic Services, Marine Reconnaissance Units, and Allied Intelligence Bureau elements operating in the Southwest Pacific. Training programs were adjusted. Intelligence teams learned maritime navigation, surf landings, and survival techniques specific to tropical environments. Submarine crews trained in launching and recovering rubber boats under cover of darkness. The Pacific environment shaped every aspect of these missions. Unlike Europe, where borders shifted and civilian populations were dense, Pacific islands offered few places to hide. Once ashore, intelligence teams depended on jungle terrain, local support, and strict radio discipline. Any transmission risked detection. Any movement risked contact with Japanese patrols trained to hunt intruders. Yet the value of these missions continued to grow. Submarine-landed teams provided intelligence that could not be obtained any other way. They verified whether airfields were operational. They observed shipping patterns in small harbors. They identified artillery positions covering beaches. In some cases, they confirmed that entire islands were far less defended than expected, opening opportunities for bypass or rapid assault. As the war progressed and Allied strategy shifted from defense to offense, these submarine insertions became a critical enabler. Planned invasions required detailed knowledge of terrain, defenses, and enemy capabilities. Without that information, amphibious landings risked disaster. With it, commanders could choose landing sites, time assaults, and apply overwhelming force where it mattered most. By mid-1943, the submarine was no longer just a weapon of attrition. It had become a courier of intelligence, delivering America's eyes and ears into territory the enemy believed was sealed off. And as these missions expanded in scope and ambition, they laid the foundation for a hidden campaign that would shape every major landing that followed. As submarine insertions proved viable, the question shifted from whether they could be done to how they could be done repeatedly, reliably, and at scale. This required a system, one that blended naval capability, intelligence planning, and unconventional warfare into a single operational method. The responsibility did not fall to one organization alone. In the Pacific, intelligence work was fragmented by geography and command structure. Admiral Chester Nimitz oversaw operations across the Central Pacific, while General Douglas MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific area. Each theater faced different terrain, enemy dispositions, and political realities. What unified them was the same problem. They needed information from places already under Japanese control. The Office of Strategic Services became a central player, but it did not operate independently. OSS teams worked alongside Navy intelligence, Marine reconnaissance units, and the Allied Intelligence Bureau, which coordinated Australian, American, and local resistance efforts. Coast watchers, many of whom had been in place before the war, remained essential sources, but their isolation meant they could not be reinforced or resupplied by conventional means. Submarines offered the only practical link. Training for submarine-landed teams evolved quickly. Intelligence personnel were no longer prepared solely for analysis or liaison roles. They learned seamanship. They practiced navigating by stars and shoreline silhouettes. They trained to paddle silently through surf zones without leaving detectable traces. Radios were redesigned to be smaller and more durable, powered by batteries that had to last weeks. Codes were simplified to reduce transmission time and exposure. Submarine crews, in turn, adapted to missions that pushed them outside traditional doctrine. Captains had to bring their boats dangerously close to shore, sometimes within a few hundred yards. Charts were often inaccurate or outdated. Coral reefs lurked beneath the surface. Mines, both real and rumored, added another layer of risk. Surf conditions could change in minutes, forcing crews to abort or improvise. Timing was everything. Insertions were planned around moon phases, tides, and Japanese patrol schedules. A landing delayed by weather could expose the submarine at dawn. A misjudged tide could leave a rubber boat stranded on a reef. These missions demanded patience and restraint, qualities not always associated with aggressive naval warfare. Once ashore, intelligence teams entered a different kind of isolation. Their presence had to remain invisible. Fires were forbidden. Movement was limited to early morning or late evening. Contact with local populations was carefully weighed. While many islanders were hostile to Japanese occupation, betrayal, intentional or accidental, could be fatal. In areas with established guerrilla movements, trust took time to build. Communication posed the greatest challenge. Radios were lifelines, but every transmission risked detection. Japanese forces were skilled at direction finding. Scouts learned to transmit in short bursts, often from different locations, then move immediately. Messages were compressed, coded, and sometimes relayed indirectly through other stations to reduce patterns. Despite these challenges, the flow of intelligence improved dramatically. Reports from submarine-landed teams began to influence operational planning in measurable ways. Airfield reconnaissance allowed planners to prioritize targets. Observations of coastal defenses shaped landing site selection. Confirmation of Japanese unit strength prevented underestimations that could have led to disaster. In the Southwest Pacific, these efforts became tightly integrated with guerrilla operations in the Philippines. Submarines delivered not only scouts, but radios, medical supplies, and advisors to resistance groups that had survived since 1942. These networks expanded American reach deep into enemy territory. Well before conventional forces returned, The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to understand how intelligence was reaching Allied commanders with such accuracy. They knew coast watchers existed, but believed most had been eliminated. Submarines were feared for their attacks on shipping, not as platforms for espionage. Coastal defenses were oriented toward repelling amphibious assault, not detecting silent landings by small teams at night. This miscalculation persisted. Even as Japanese commanders increased patrols and tightened security, the sheer length of coastlines and the complexity of island terrain made total coverage impossible. Submarines exploited these gaps with growing confidence. By 1944, submarine insertion missions were no longer experimental. They were planned components of major operations. Scouts went ashore weeks before invasions, sometimes months. They stayed long enough to confirm patterns, not just snapshots. Their intelligence fed directly into assault timetables, airstrike plans, and logistics preparations. The submarine, once a lone hunter beneath the waves, had become a conduit between invisible observers and the highest levels of command. Through it flowed information that could not be photographed, intercepted, or guessed. And as Allied forces prepared for the largest amphibious operations of the Pacific War, the role of these hidden insertions became not just useful but decisive. From the inside, these missions were defined by waiting. Long hours submerged, long nights off hostile shores. Men sat quietly as the submarine drifted, listening to the creak of the hull and the distant churn of enemy patrols. For the scouts preparing to go ashore, this was often the last moment of certainty. Once they left the boat, nothing was guaranteed, not extraction, not rescue, not survival. The human cost of these operations rarely appeared in official summaries. Intelligence teams were small, often 2 to 6 men, selected for resilience rather than rank. Many were volunteers. Some were former civilians with technical skills, radio operators, linguists, engineers. Others were Marines or sailors, accustomed to combat. What united them was the understanding that they would operate alone, unsupported, and officially deniable. Fear was constant, but discipline was stronger. Scouts memorized terrain features before landing, knowing maps could be lost or destroyed. They rehearsed emergency drills repeatedly, what to do if the boat capsized, if a radio failed, if Japanese troops appeared sooner than expected. Once ashore, they moved slowly, measuring every step, avoiding paths that might reveal footprints or broken foliage. From a tactical standpoint, the submarine insertion solved multiple problems at once. Aircraft could not linger over targets without alerting defenses. Surface ships could not approach unnoticed. Submarines, however, exploited the Japanese assumption that shallow coastal waters were safe. Their approach routes were unpredictable. A submarine could arrive hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied base, deploy a team, then disappear again before dawn. This unpredictability disrupted Japanese defensive planning. Coastal defenses were designed to detect invasion forces, not lone rubber boats landing far from major facilities. Patrol patterns were fixed, often focused on harbors and known landing beaches. Scouts exploited these blind spots, choosing isolated coves, mangrove-lined shores, or reef gaps only visible at certain tides. The Japanese perspective revealed a dangerous gap in their doctrine. Intelligence and counterintelligence efforts prioritized espionage within civilian populations and resistance movements. The idea that enemy submarines were placing observers ashore behind their lines, sometimes repeatedly, was slow to gain acceptance. Reports of sightings were often dismissed as rumors or exaggerated claims. Technologically, the limitations of the era shaped every decision. Radios were bulky and fragile. Batteries were precious. Scouts could not transmit freely. Every message had to matter. This forced intelligence gathering to be deliberate and selective. Teams focused on confirming key facts rather than collecting everything possible. Was the airfield operational? How many aircraft were present? Were fuel supplies visible? Had defenses changed since the last report? Leadership at higher levels began to trust these reports with increasing confidence. In the early war years, commanders often treated intelligence cautiously, aware of past failures and deception. By 1944, submarine-landed reports were influencing decisions directly. Airstrikes were redirected, landing beaches were reconsidered, timelines were adjusted. The voice of a scout hidden in jungle terrain could shape the movement of entire fleets. For the enemy, the psychological impact grew quietly. Japanese units discovered airfields destroyed before they could be used, supply convoys ambushed with uncanny precision, and defensive positions neutralized in advance. This fostered a sense of exposure. The belief that territory was secure once occupied began to erode. Jungle concealment no longer guaranteed safety. Yet these successes carried a moral weight. Scouts operated knowing that local civilians and guerrilla allies faced severe reprisals if discovered. Japanese countermeasures often targeted villages suspected of aiding intelligence teams. Scouts had to weigh the value of information against the risk to those who helped them. This calculus added another layer of burden to already dangerous missions. The relationship between scouts and submarine crews also evolved. Trust was absolute. The crew delivered the team into enemy territory, knowing they might be asked to return under equally dangerous conditions weeks later. Missed rendezvous were common. Weather, enemy activity, or simple miscalculation could force submarines to withdraw, leaving teams stranded indefinitely. Despite these risks, the method endured because it worked. Intelligence gathered through submarine insertions proved more reliable than aerial estimates and more timely than intercepted communications. It provided texture, sounds, smells, routines that no photograph could capture. As the war moved toward its climactic invasions, this intelligence became indispensable. The scouts were no longer supporting operations on the margins. They were shaping the center of gravity of the Pacific campaign. And to understand how deeply their work penetrated the enemy's defenses, the next angle must follow how these missions expanded in scope, technology, and consequence. As these missions expanded, the technical dimension became as critical as the human one. Radios were the scouts' only link to the outside world, and their design dictated how intelligence could be gathered and transmitted. Early sets were heavy, unreliable in tropical humidity, and limited in range. By 1943 and 1944, improvements allowed for shorter transmissions and greater flexibility, but power remained a constant concern. Batteries could not be replaced easily. Every transmission drained a finite resource. This constraint shaped behavior. Scouts waited days, sometimes weeks, to confirm patterns before sending a message. A single report might summarize dozens of observations compressed into coded phrases. Intelligence officers learned to read between the lines, extracting meaning from brevity. The system rewarded patience and punished haste. Submarines also underwent quiet adaptation. Crews modified storage spaces to carry rubber boats, fuel, and supplies for intelligence teams. Some boats installed additional communication equipment to receive transmissions while submerged. Navigation practices improved as crews gained experience operating close to hostile coastlines. Charts were annotated with first-hand observations, building a collective memory that reduced risk over time. Leadership played a decisive role in institutionalizing these missions. In the Pacific, commanders such as Nimitz and MacArthur recognized that amphibious warfare depended on knowing where not to land as much as where to land. Intelligence failures early in the war had been costly. The submarine insertion program offered a way to reduce uncertainty without exposing large forces. At the same time, these operations tested command relationships. Intelligence teams often operated across service boundaries. Navy submarines delivered Marine or OSS personnel. Guerrilla groups answered to different authorities. Coordination required flexibility and trust. Success depended on clear objectives, and disciplined restraint teams were forbidden from engaging in combat unless absolutely necessary, even when opportunities presented themselves. From the enemy's perspective, countermeasures evolved slowly. Japanese forces increased patrols, built listening posts, and encouraged civilian reporting. Yet the sheer scale of occupied territory made comprehensive coverage impossible. Submarine insertions exploited not only physical gaps but cognitive ones. Japanese doctrine emphasized repelling massed assaults, not detecting small, patient observers. The moral dimension of these missions deepened as the war progressed. Scouts witnessed the effects of occupation firsthand: forced labor, shortages, reprisals. Some intelligence teams faced pressure to assist local resistance beyond their mandate. Balancing mission objectives with humanitarian impulses was a constant tension. Official doctrine emphasized intelligence first, but reality blurred those lines. As 1944 approached, the focus shifted toward decisive campaigns. The Philippines became a primary objective. Intelligence needs multiplied. Submarines inserted teams to assess beach conditions, coastal currents, and enemy deployments. Scouts linked with guerrilla networks that had endured years of isolation. Reports flowed back, confirming weaknesses and identifying opportunities that shaped invasion planning. In these moments, the cumulative effect of submarine insertions became clear. Each mission added a layer to an increasingly detailed picture. Patterns emerged. Japanese airfields were often operational only intermittently due to fuel shortages. Coastal defenses varied widely in quality. Some islands were heavily fortified, others were held by understrength units with low morale. This intelligence allowed commanders to bypass strong points, concentrate force where it mattered, and avoid costly frontal assaults. It also accelerated operations. Where planners once hesitated, they now acted with confidence. Timelines compressed, casualties decreased. The psychological impact on Japanese forces intensified. Reports of unseen observers and unexplained strikes spread unease. The sense that the enemy knew too much eroded confidence. Defensive efforts became reactive rather than proactive. By the time major invasions began, the groundwork had already been laid beneath the surface. Submarines had carried not just men and equipment, but knowledge. That knowledge would soon be tested under fire, and when the moment came to transform intelligence into action, the war reached a turning point that revealed just how decisive these hidden missions had become. By late 1944, the intelligence gathered from submarine insertions was no longer theoretical. It was about to be tested against the largest amphibious operations the Pacific had ever seen. The Philippines, lost in 1942, now stood at the center of Allied strategy. Its recapture would sever Japan's southern supply routes and bring American forces within striking distance of the home islands. Weeks before the first landings, submarines were already moving. Under cover of darkness, they approached the Philippine coastline, slipping through waters still believed by Japanese commanders to be relatively secure. Rubber boats were launched again. Scouts went ashore carrying radios, code sheets, and instructions that allowed no margin for error. These teams fanned out along coastlines and inland routes, some embedded with guerrilla units that had survived years of occupation. Others operated independently, observing airfields, ports, and troop concentrations. Their reports confirmed what aerial reconnaissance could not: which runways were actually usable, which coastal guns were manned, which roads could support rapid movement, and which would choke advancing forces. One of the most critical findings involved Japanese air power. Submarine-landed scouts identified concealed airfields that had been missed or underestimated by previous assessments. They reported aircraft counts, fuel storage locations, and maintenance activity. In some cases, they confirmed that fields listed as operational were little more than damaged strips struggling to function. This information reshaped airstrike priorities in the days leading up to the invasion. As invasion fleets assembled, intelligence continued to flow. Scouts transmitted updates even as Japanese patrols increased. They reported changes in defensive posture, signs of reinforcements, and efforts to camouflage positions further. Each message was short. Each carried weight. When Allied forces finally moved ashore, the impact of this intelligence became visible. Air attacks struck the correct targets. Many Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could engage invasion fleets. Coastal defenses were suppressed more quickly than expected. Beaches once feared proved less lethal than planners had anticipated. Submarine crews, listening from offshore patrol areas, received confirmation that the intelligence they had helped deliver was shaping events in real time. The quiet work of insertion missions had translated into measurable battlefield advantage. In New Guinea and surrounding regions, similar patterns emerged. Scouts inserted by submarine had identified bypass routes around heavily fortified positions. Japanese units, expecting frontal assaults, found themselves isolated as Allied forces moved past them. Supply lines were cut, airfields rendered useless, garrisons were left to wither without support. Japanese commanders struggled to respond. The speed and precision of Allied operations suggested a level of insight they could not explain. Defensive plans collapsed faster than anticipated. The psychological shock compounded material losses. The belief that terrain and concealment provided safety was shattered. For the scouts still operating behind enemy lines, the climax carried personal risk. Japanese counterintelligence intensified, patrols expanded, radio detection efforts increased. Some teams narrowly avoided capture, others went silent, their fate unknown until after the war. Extraction windows shrank as front lines advanced and operational priorities shifted. Yet the system held. Submarines returned to pre-arranged points, sometimes repeatedly, to retrieve teams or relocate them to new objectives. The coordination required was extraordinary. A missed rendezvous could mean abandonment. A single mistake could expose both submarine and scouts to destruction. By early 1945, the results were undeniable. Intelligence from submarine insertions had reduced uncertainty across multiple campaigns. Landings proceeded with fewer surprises. Japanese air power, already strained by attrition, was further neutralized before it could be brought to bear. The initiative remained firmly in Allied hands. This was the turning point. The moment when a quiet, experimental method proved itself indispensable at the highest level of war. Submarines had not just delivered scouts, they had delivered clarity. And as the campaign moved toward its final phases, the question was no longer whether these missions mattered, but how far their influence extended and what it ultimately meant for the outcome of the war. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Japanese-held territory, the cumulative effect of submarine-landed intelligence became impossible to ignore. What had once been isolated successes now formed a pattern that shaped the tempo of the entire campaign. The enemy was no longer reacting to overwhelming force alone. They were reacting to being anticipated. In the Philippines, the collapse of Japanese air resistance accelerated rapidly. Submarine-inserted scouts had identified not only airfields, but the fragile systems that supported them. Fuel shortages, spare parts, and maintenance crews were often the limiting factors. Allied planners exploited these vulnerabilities. Bombing campaigns were timed to coincide with peak aircraft concentration on the ground. Airstrips were cratered repeatedly, denying repair windows. Aircraft that survived initial strikes found nowhere safe to operate. Japanese attempts to relocate air units were hampered by intelligence already in Allied hands. Scouts reported new construction sites and emergency landing areas as they appeared. Submarines relayed this information to air and naval forces, compressing the enemy's decision cycle. Every attempt to adapt was met with a response before it could mature. On the ground, similar dynamics unfolded. Coastal defenses, once assumed to be formidable, were bypassed or neutralized with precision. Scouts had mapped artillery positions and patrol routines. Landings avoided strong points and targeted gaps. Japanese units found themselves isolated, cut off from reinforcement or withdrawal routes that Allied commanders already understood better than the defenders themselves. The psychological impact reached a breaking point. Japanese troops encountered attacks that seemed impossibly well informed. Supply convoys were ambushed, command posts were struck, defensive plans unraveled under pressure from multiple directions. The sense of being watched, of operating in a battle space already known to the enemy, undermined morale. For the scouts still in the field, the climax was a race against time. As front lines advanced, their operating areas shrank. Some teams transitioned from observation to liaison, guiding advancing units through terrain they had studied for months. Others awaited extraction that grew increasingly risky as Japanese forces concentrated on counterintelligence sweeps. Submarines continued to shoulder extraordinary risk. Extraction missions often took place in waters now crowded with Allied shipping and Japanese remnants alike. Navigating to precise pickup points required flawless coordination. A single miscalculation could expose a submarine to shallow water hazards or enemy fire. Yet crews pressed on, understanding that abandoning intelligence teams was not an option. In several cases, scouts were evacuated just days before Japanese positions collapsed. Their final reports were transmitted hours before extraction, providing last-minute updates that influenced follow-on operations. These moments underscored the fragile margin between success and catastrophe. By the spring of 1945, the role of submarine insertions had reached its peak. The method had proven itself across multiple theaters. It had shortened campaigns, reduced casualties, and denied the enemy the ability to recover or regroup. Intelligence was no longer a supporting function, it was a decisive weapon. Japanese commanders, reviewing the wreckage of their defensive network, faced an uncomfortable truth. Control of territory had not guaranteed security. The sea, once a barrier, had become a conduit for the enemy. Submarines had turned isolation into exposure. For Allied leadership, the lessons were equally profound. The integration of intelligence, naval mobility, and unconventional operations had reshaped modern warfare. Submarines were no longer just hunters. They were enablers of precision, carrying knowledge into places firepower alone could not reach. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the legacy of these missions was already taking shape. Plans for future conflicts would reflect what had been learned in silence and darkness. The quiet war beneath the waves had altered the course of the visible one. And with the enemy's defenses collapsing faster than they could be rebuilt, the final phase began not with surprise landings, but with the realization that Japan's hidden positions were hidden no longer. The immediate aftermath of these operations became evident as Allied forces consolidated control across the Western Pacific. Islands, once considered dangerous unknowns, were now understood landscapes. Japanese airfields that had threatened invasion fleets lay silent, cratered, or abandoned. Coastal defenses that might have inflicted heavy losses had been neutralized or bypassed entirely. Operational reports compiled after major landings confirmed the impact. Casualty rates during amphibious assaults were lower than planners had feared. Japanese air response during critical windows was weaker, often delayed or absent. In several sectors, aircraft never reached the air at all. Intelligence gathered weeks earlier by submarine-landed scouts had already sealed their fate. Commanders acknowledged this shift openly in post-operation assessments. Intelligence no longer arrived late, filtered through layers of uncertainty. It arrived early, precise, and verified. Decisions once made cautiously were executed with confidence. The tempo of operations increased, leaving Japanese forces little time to adapt or recover. Captured Japanese documents and post-war interrogations further clarified the effect. Enemy commanders described persistent confusion about how Allied forces seemed to know so much about their positions. Reports of unseen observers and unexplained intelligence leaks circulated among Japanese units, feeding suspicion and eroding trust. Counterintelligence efforts expanded, but by then the damage was done. For submarine crews, the aftermath brought a quiet sense of accomplishment. Their role rarely appeared in headlines. Success was measured not in tonnage sunk, but in lives spared and battles shortened. Many crews completed intelligence missions without ever knowing the full consequences of what they had enabled. For the scouts, the end of missions was often anticlimactic. Extraction did not mean recognition. Many returned to anonymity, their work still classified. Some teams were never fully accounted for, their losses absorbed into the shadows of wartime record-keeping. The nature of their service ensured that acknowledgement would come slowly, if at all. The Japanese defensive collapse accelerated in the war's final months. As Allied forces advanced, the absence of reliable intelligence and secure rear areas crippled resistance. Air power, once a central pillar of Japanese strategy, had been stripped of its foundation. Hidden airfields could no longer protect aircraft from discovery. The sea lanes once feared became conduits for Allied dominance. These outcomes were not the result of a single battle or weapon. They were the product of sustained, patient effort of intelligence, gathered quietly and applied decisively. Submarine insertions had multiplied the effectiveness of every subsequent operation. Yet the full meaning of these missions extended beyond immediate military success. Their influence reshaped how war would be planned and fought long after the guns fell silent. As the war ended, the record of submarine-landed intelligence operations remained fragmented and incomplete. Many missions were still classified. Reports were scattered across naval archives, OSS files, and unit histories. The men involved returned home without public acknowledgement, bound by secrecy agreements that lasted years, sometimes decades. Post-war evaluations slowly brought clarity. Military analysts reviewing Pacific campaigns consistently highlighted the value of accurate, timely intelligence. Amphibious landings, once feared as the most dangerous operations of the war, were now seen as carefully prepared, their risks reduced through information gathered long before the first wave reached the beach. Submarine insertions emerged as a critical contributor to that preparation. The techniques refined during these missions did not disappear. They became part of institutional memory. Cold War doctrine absorbed the lessons learned how to combine stealth, mobility, and intelligence in denied areas. Submarines continued to evolve as platforms not only for weapons, but for reconnaissance and special operations. The quiet war beneath the waves became a permanent feature of military planning. For Japan, the aftermath was marked by reflection on vulnerabilities exposed too late. Post-war assessments acknowledged that reliance on concealment and geographic isolation had fostered a false sense of security. Once Allied forces penetrated that isolation, defensive systems collapsed rapidly. The inability to prevent intelligence infiltration proved as damaging as losses in combat. Among veterans, memories of these operations remained vivid. Submarine crewmen recalled the tension of near-shore operations, the responsibility of delivering men into danger. Scouts remembered the weight of silence, the discipline required to observe without acting, and the constant awareness that discovery meant death. These experiences shaped lives long after the war ended. Historical recognition came slowly. As documents were declassified, scholars and historians pieced together the scope of submarine insertion missions. What emerged was a portrait of warfare that defied popular imagery. The decisive moments were not always explosive. Often they were quiet, deliberate, and invisible. The war in the Pacific was won through overwhelming force, but it was shaped by knowledge. Submarine-landed scouts provided that knowledge at critical moments, turning uncertainty into advantage. Their contribution did not end the war alone, but it ensured that when force was applied, it was applied with precision. And in that precision lies the deeper legacy of these missions. A reminder that control of information can alter the course of history as profoundly as control of territory. The war in the Pacific is often remembered as a contest of scale. Vast fleets, endless islands, battles that stretched across oceans. Yet beneath that enormity ran a quieter current, one that moved slowly and deliberately, shaping outcomes long before forces collided. The submarine insertions of intelligence teams belonged to that hidden current. These missions did not seek confrontation, they sought understanding. Men slipped ashore not to fight, but to watch. They learned the rhythms of occupied islands, the habits of enemy units, the fragile systems that kept airfields and defenses alive. What they gathered could not be photographed cleanly or intercepted over radio waves. It had to be seen, felt, confirmed by human presence. In doing so, they changed how the war was fought. Intelligence ceased to be a reactive tool and became a guiding force. Invasions were no longer leaps into the unknown. They were calculated entries into terrain already mapped in detail. Air power struck where it mattered most. Ground forces moved with confidence, born not of optimism, but of preparation. The submarines that carried these teams represented a similar evolution. Once conceived purely as hunters, they became bridges between secrecy and strategy. They delivered knowledge into enemy-held space and carried it back across thousands of miles of ocean. Their success depended not on speed or firepower, but on patience, discipline, and restraint. For the men involved, the experience left deep marks. Scouts lived with constant awareness of exposure. Submarine crews bore the responsibility of placing others in danger and returning to retrieve them, sometimes under impossible conditions. Their service unfolded without ceremony, measured only in the absence of disaster and the quiet success of operations that went according to plan. Japan's defeat was shaped by many forces: industrial power, attrition, and battlefield loss. Yet these intelligence missions revealed a vulnerability that force alone could not conceal. Control of territory did not equal control of information. Once that illusion was broken, defensive systems collapsed with surprising speed. The legacy of these operations extended far beyond 1945. Modern warfare absorbed their lessons. Stealth, reconnaissance, and intelligence integration became central pillars of military planning. Submarines remained tools not only of deterrence, but of insight. Special operations doctrine carried forward the belief that small teams, placed carefully, could influence outcomes far beyond their size. History often celebrates the visible moment, the landing, the battle, the surrender. But those moments are built on decisions made earlier, in silence. The scouts who stepped from submarines onto hostile shores rarely appear in headlines, yet the clarity they provided shaped every move that followed. In the end, their story is not just about how wars are won, but how they are understood. It is a reminder that knowledge, patiently gathered and wisely applied, can be as decisive as any weapon ever built.